Well, please open your Bibles to the book of Ezekiel. But before we do that, I've got a quick quiz for you. And you can play like you're on Jeopardy maybe or some other game show. My first question is, what Old Testament prophet saw a vision of a wheel within a wheel? Oh, y'all got that right. It's Ezekiel. All right, let's go on to the next one. Which Old Testament prophet saw a vision of a river flowing from the throne of God, bringing life to everything it touched? Even the Dead Sea came to life. Was that Ezekiel? Starts with an E, ends with an L. What Old Testament prophet saw a vision of dry bones being brought back to life? Oh, Ezekiel. What Old Testament prophet saw a vision of God's glory departing the temple? It was Ezekiel. And which Old Testament prophet saw a vision of a future temple? That was Ezekiel too. So, y'all did right well on that quiz. All right. You'll see on this paper, though, some historical background, and some of you love history and some of you don't. So those of you that don't, kind of bear with me for just a minute, because many of the things that we're going to look at in Ezekiel are kind of dependent on you understanding the historical context. So take this in, if you can, for just a minute or two. You need to know that God has constantly been pouring out His love on people and encouraging them to love Him with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love each other as they love themselves. But people don't. And so God's people would constantly turn to idols, and they would treat each other meanly and poorly and do all kinds of terrible, evil things. God sent prophet after prophet after prophet after prophet, which they ignored and did exactly what they wanted to do instead of the way that they could have lived, which would have been honoring and pleasing to God and would have given them the very best life possible. So, to say that another way, they brought a lot of trouble on themselves. Does that sound familiar, by the way? Do we also bring a lot of trouble on ourselves? Well, in 722, God's judgment took the form of the Assyrians. They came in and they destroyed the northern kingdom. They took all the brightest and the best, and they transplanted them to other parts of the Assyrian Empire. They took people from other parts of the Assyrian Empire and transplanted them in the northern kingdom of Israel. And that's the origin of the group in the New Testament that are referred to as the Samaritans. And so that's what happened in 722 BC. But a few years later, 21 years later, the Assyrians were going to take over Judah. And so they were coming to Jerusalem and about to knock on the door. But God intervened, and He protected the city of Jerusalem. He sent the Assyrians packing, and you'll see a note here that some 100,085 soldiers got killed in the process. So God, in a miraculous way, protected and preserved His people. Now, you would think that would mean that they're going to start trusting Him. What you reckon happened? They didn't. And Hezekiah was the king, and you would think he would have thought, man, the Lord has saved us, and we're going to trust Him. But he began to make alliances, and those alliances backfired on him. So sometime later, he invited envoys from Babylon, and he gave them the tour, showed them the temple, showed them all kinds of stuff, and he was trying to kind of get their favor so they could be allies. And Isaiah came to him and said, you have done a terrible thing. You should be trusting in the Lord and not trying to do all this politicking. And these very people that you've given the grand tour of, they're going to come in a few years and take all this back to their kingdom. And so Hezekiah thought, oh, that's bad. But then he heard real carefully that Isaiah said in a few years, and Hezekiah said, well, that's going to be somebody else's problem to deal with. I'll be dead and gone. So he didn't worry about it too much. Well, in 625, the Babylonians freed themselves from the Assyrians, and then they began to capture Assyrian cities, and then eventually they took over the city of Nineveh. And there are a lot of passages in the Bible that talk about the fall of Nineveh, and that nothing really was built back there. So it was a tremendous city that lay desolate for, well, the It's still desolate for the most part. In 609 BC, King Josiah got involved. He was allied with the Babylonians, and he was trying to delay the Egyptians, and he met them at a place called Megiddo, which is where it's the site of what Revelation points to as the last battle, the Battle of Armageddon. And in that battle with the Egyptians, King Josiah, who was one of the few good kings of Judah, died, was killed in the conflict. And his brother got appointed king by the Egyptian Pharaoh. But along the way, he switches sides and pledges his allegiance to Babylon after the Egyptians were defeated by the Babylonians, and they took hostages to ensure their loyalty. And among the hostages were some young men. Anybody know what their names were? Did y'all say Daniel? Did I hear y'all say Daniel? And Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah? Those last three we know by their Babylonian names. Y'all remember what they were? Shadrach. What kind of name is that? Meshach and Abednego. Yeah, so that happened in 605 BC. These young men were kidnapped and taken away from their homes and raised as Babylonians. But the Lord was with them and took care of them all the way along. Well, in 598, King Jehoiakim rebels against Babylon. The Babylonians crush the revolt, and Jehoiakim is killed, but his son, Jehoiachin, succeeds him as king. And he becomes an important reference point for the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is a book that is, he tells us what time and what day and what the particulars are before each vision. And the reference point is the exile of Jehoiakim. This fellow right here, Jehoiachin. So he looks to Egypt for help, and within 3 months, the Babylonians take him into exile, along with many temple treasures and many of Judah's leading citizens, as many as 10,000 of the people of Judah. And one of those was a man named Ezekiel. So Ezekiel was taken into exile. Zedekiah was put on the throne of Judah. And it's 5 years after that, in 593, that Ezekiel's ministry begins as a prophet. And you'll see some other history here. Zedekiah rebels again against Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar comes. He conquers all the different cities in Judah. He sieges the city of Jerusalem. And that is one of the most horrific events in all of human history. They took refuge in the temple. They took refuge in the city. They ate each other's children. They did absolutely horrible, horrific, atrocious, terrible things when the Babylonians seized the city of Jerusalem. It was absolutely awful. And I'd like to tell you that won't ever happen again. But human nature does not change. And when the Romans sieged Jerusalem in 70 AD, the exact same thing happened. And so it's a repeat of things. And Jesus, in his teaching about the end times, says, hey, you remember what this was like? Well, it's going to be like that, only worse. So we know that there will be a future event like that from Jesus' teaching. So Jerusalem, the city, is destroyed. And that's an important marker for the book of Ezekiel. I'll point this out again in just a minute. But before Jerusalem is destroyed, Ezekiel's messages are about judgment. And you've got to repent, you've got to turn, God is coming in judgment. And then after Jerusalem is destroyed, Ezekiel's message is about hope and restoration, and that God's not finished with us. And so there are two different main messages that are fixed depending on what has happened to the people and to Jerusalem. Solomon's temple is completely destroyed, 586 BC. Most of the population is killed or even taken into captivity. The king Jehoiachin gets released from prison in 561 and eats at the king's table. And that's the little tiny ray of hope that's given as the Old Testament ends. And we know from our reading of Matthew's gospel that he is an ancestor of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So God's promise that someone from the line of David would rule and have a kingdom that would never end always hung by a thread. And particularly during this time, we see God's working through his promises, God being faithful to his promises, even though the situation just looks very, very bleak. Well, I mentioned that Ezekiel's ministry begins in 593 BC, and the part we'll look at tonight that's the date. In fact, Ezekiel is so exacting here that on our calendar it would be July 31st, 593. So lots of details that connect it with history. He gets his calling, and you'll see in a minute that he is 30 years old, which, according to the book of Numbers, is when you became eligible to be a priest. And so Ezekiel his family is of that priestly line, and so instead of becoming a priest in the temple at Jerusalem, because in a few years that temple is going to be destroyed, he becomes a prophet in exile. And so you'll see kind of dates there with the rest of Ezekiel, chapters 4 through 23, and then after Jerusalem falls, chapters 33 and following. And you'll see that Ezekiel kind of progresses through a theme: judgment and exile in the first 24 chapters, judgment on the nations till chapter 32, and then hope and restoration from chapters 33 till 48. So there was this man who wanted to give his son a pocket knife. Sounds like a good Woodruff thing to do, doesn't it? So he buys him a Swiss Army knife and he gives it to him, but he gives him that responsibility speech. You know, this is a beautiful, wonderful tool. It's not a weapon. Use it responsibly. Here's the things you can do with it. Here's the things you can't do with it. And he feels good about the purchase, feels good about his son, and it's a exercise in trust. But then in a couple days he gets a call, and his 10-year-old son has held up the 7-year-old neighbor with his Swiss Army pocket knife. So now he has to give a whole different speech about how you have, disappointed me, and you hadn't lived up to the trust I put in you. And what do you think he does with the knife? Takes it back. So some time passes, and the son begins to demonstrate his trustworthiness again, and the father says, well, let's talk, because I think you're earning my trust back, and there might be a date coming up when you can be a responsible knife owner again. All right, so same father, same son, 3 different kinds of speeches. Y'all get that? And that's kind of how Ezekiel rolls. So at the beginning, it's a harsh speech about judgment that's coming. And then after judgment has come, it's a word of hope and encouragement and help. The word Ezekiel means that God is strong, or God strengthens. He was born in 623 BC, born in that priestly line. Psalm 137 kind of captures the spirit of the exiles. We can't even begin to imagine what it would be like to have to leave home and family to move to a place that has a different language, different culture, and be looked down on with very few resources. So they're basically thousands of people are living in a makeshift refugee camp along one of the tributaries to the Euphrates River. And so the situation looks pretty bleak, and it's going to get worse. And so this is where Ezekiel finds himself. Psalm 137 says, by the waters of Babylon we sat down and wept. And our enemy said, sing us one of the songs of Zion. And they say, we can't sing the songs of Zion here. This is a desolate, God-forsaken place. So that's the spirit of the exiles captured in that psalm for us. During the time of Ezekiel's ministry, it overlaps with Jeremiah and Daniel. And during Ezekiel's childhood, Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah are active. There are a lot of words that repeat in the book of Ezekiel, and I pointed some of those out. God refers to Ezekiel as the Son of Man, which is a pretty high compliment because that's Jesus' favorite designation for himself. So that occurs 93 times. There are all manner of thus saith the Lord kind of things in Ezekiel. That you may know I am the Lord occurs 60 times. Then the word of the Lord came to me saying 46 times. And I, the Lord, have spoken occurs very frequently. But one of the big things, and we'll see this a bunch in the passage we'll look at tonight, is the role of the Spirit. Some call Ezekiel the prophet of the Spirit because the Spirit is at work in a very powerful, wonderful way. And the word for Spirit is Ruha. Now, would y'all say that with me? You got to say it like I did, though. Ruha. All right, if you say it right, it becomes an exhalation. You know, breathe in, Ruha, breathe out. Right? That's how you got to say it. It is the word for spirit. It's the word for wind. It's the word for breath. So God forms man out of the dust of the earth, and then he ruhas. He breathes his spirit into the man he has formed, and man becomes a living being. And so this is a powerful word that we'll see throughout Ezekiel. Well, that might be enough introduction. Let's look at chapter 1, verse 1. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day, while I was among the exiles of the Kebar River, the heavens were opened, and I saw a vision of God. That phrase, the heavens were opened, does not occur very often in Scripture. We see that when Jesus is baptized. We see that when Stephen is stoned. We see that in some of the stories of Moses, but very rarely do we see that phrase in the Bible. So Ezekiel is given a big insight into God. Now, I gave you these papers and they're pens. If y'all could just take a moment and draw a picture of God. Just kidding. How in the world would you picture God? Well, in the New Testament, we know that God is spirit. And there's a really cool hymn that we sing, God, invisible, immortal. I don't know how that goes. Yeah, that's it. That's the tune. God only wise. Invisible, immortal, God only wise. That might be how it goes. God is invisible. God is spirit. God does not need a body. And yet, God is constantly revealing himself to us. And we, at times, need to see God. And so Moses wanted to see God, and God showed him his back. Isaiah, in the year that King Uzziah died, came into the temple, and he saw a vision of God's feet and the flow of his robe that filled the entire temple. And so, in this moment in history, in this moment in time, Ezekiel needs to see a vision of the living God. And God shows up. So he has a vision of God. And we got more dates here. On the 5th of the month, the 5th year, exile of King Jehoiakim, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel, the priest, son of Bazu, by the Kebar River in the land of the Babylonians. There the hand of the Lord was on him. I looked, and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. So it's coming from the north. The north is typically the direction that trouble comes from. And so immediately we are aware that this might not be a pleasant visit because trouble comes from the north, and that's where this big storm is coming. And so from a distance, he sees a storm, but you can already tell that there are special effects. Hollywood has nothing on the Bible. So there's flashes and lightning and all kinds of special effects. So Ezekiel is already tuned into the fact that this is a powerful, life-changing experience. At the center of the fire looked like glowing metal. So that's pretty hot, isn't it? When fire gets to the point that it looks like glowing metal. And in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. I like to go to the zoo. Do y'all like to go to the zoo? There are all kinds of critters at the zoo. I don't know how many critters they have at the zoo, but a bunch. Would y'all agree? It's a whole heap of things. And God didn't make just one kind of things. He made all kinds of diverse things here on the earth. Do you reckon that's also true of heaven? Are there heavenly creatures? Well, as we read the Bible carefully, we'll see that there are a lot. Cherubim and seraphim and living creatures and elders and angels and all kinds of things that God has made. So I would expect that the diversity in heaven is maybe even greater than it is here on earth. And so here we see in the fire something that Ezekiel identifies as living creatures. Now, look at the wording there, because this is also going to happen all through this vision. He doesn't say they were living creatures. He says they looked like living creatures. Or to say that another way, his language is going to fail. He does not have the words to adequately describe what he's seeing. And so everything from this point on is, well, it's kind of like, or it's sort of like, or it reminds me of, or it looks like, or because he doesn't have the vocabulary to communicate what he's seeing. He's seeing something so alien, so different, so unusual that he's doing his best, but he doesn't quite have the words to be able to describe these things adequately. So he said it looked like 4 living creatures, and then he tries to describe them. And even getting a picture in our head of what these living creatures look like is difficult for us. You'll see what I mean as I keep reading. In appearance, their form was human. All right, we got that part. We are familiar with, humans. But each of them had 4 faces. Y'all ever seen anybody with 4 faces? I've never seen anybody with 4 faces. And 4 wings. Their legs were straight, but their feet were like those of a calf and gleamed like burnished bronze. That sounds unusual, doesn't it? Under their wings, on their 4 sides, they had human hands. And all 4 of them had faces and wings, and the wings of one touched the wings of another. And each one went straight ahead, and they did not turn as they moved. So he's describing here something we've never seen before, not in our zoos. And there is a harmony that's existing between these 4 creatures. Their wings are touching each other. They all have 4 faces, and they are moving in unison. And if you got 4... Do any of y'all ever have a mother who had eyes in the back of her head? What does that expression mean? She knows all. She sees everything. Imagine if your mama had 4 faces. Could you get anything past her? Not a thing. So these living creatures see everything, and that will become evident as we keep reading. And they've got these bronze legs. Now, I've been having a little trouble with my feet lately. But if my legs were bronze, you reckon I could go fur? These living creatures are equipped to move. But not only do they have legs of bronze, what else they got? Yeah, they've got wings. So they can travel in any direction, up, down, right, left, side to side, diagonally, at a moment's notice. And they don't have to turn. Now, y'all probably don't have any trouble with this when you're in one of those tight parking spaces and you got people whizzing back behind you and you got people walking behind you and you're trying to figure out when you can back out. That probably doesn't ring any bells with anybody. But boy, I have trouble with that. I look and I look again and I keep looking and I ease out an inch or two and eventually I make it out of the parking space. But these living creatures, they don't have that trouble. They can see everything, and they can move in any direction faster than lightning. So hold on to that thought. It'll make more sense as we keep going. Their faces look like this. Each of the four had the face of a human being. Well, that sounds nice. I've met human beings in my time, and they got faces of a human being. All right. And on the right side, each had the face of a lion. Ooh, that's different. And on the left side, the face of an ox, and each also had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. All right, Ezekiel is calling them living creatures. What area of the world does a lion rule over? The jungle. He might even be the king of the jungle. We got songs and movies about that. But they did too back then. Maybe not the movies, but they thought of the lion as the king of the jungle, an apex predator. How about an eagle? What part of the world does an eagle rule over? Yeah. All right, what about an ox? Strong as an ox. Of all the different animals that we can domesticate, which one you reckon is the strongest? Yeah. So here you have some representatives of God's creation. God takes glory in his creation. God loves his creation. Read the book of Job, and you'll see God just enchanted with ostriches and all these cool things that he's made. And so here you have representation of all creatures. And there are four of them. You reckon there's any significance to that? Well, 4 is a number in the ancient world that represents the earth. We still have some residual thoughts about that because we have north and east and south and west. How many directions did I name? 4. And we talk about earth and wind and fire and water. How many was that? 4. So 4 is a number that represents the earth. And this really comes into play when we get to the book of Revelation. Because anytime there are 4 things mentioned, it's talking about the earth. And so John will take this and run with it when in his vision in Revelation. So these 4 living creatures are there, and that's what Ezekiel. That's what Ezekiel focuses on first, is these living creatures. Maybe they're at eye level. And so he sees these strange 4 animals with 4 faces, but yet they're not animals, they're human, and he doesn't quite know what to call them, and he calls them living creatures. If you want to know more about what Ezekiel sees, you look at chapter 10 of Ezekiel, because there he will describe them again, and he'll give a few more details, and in Ezekiel 10 he'll say, I've been calling them living creatures, but I believe they are cherubim. What's a cherubim? What's a cherub? Well, in our culture, a cherub is kind of a little baby-faced, Cupid-looking thingy. But in the Bible, cherubs are fierce warriors. When Adam and Eve are forced out of the Garden of Eden, God puts a cherub there with a flaming sword to keep them from coming back in and getting to the tree of life, because it will be absolutely horrible to be stuck in a fallen, sinful state for all eternity. So the tree of life is guarded. You get to Exodus, and the curtains in the tabernacle, and then later in the temple, have cherubim on there. And so many of the things that God has Moses build represent that Garden of Eden in the presence of God as people came to worship. And the Ark of the Covenant, it had 2 cherubim with their wings outstretched that formed a throne for God on the top of the Ark of the Covenant. So there was a point in time when human beings knew what cherubim looked like because they saw them a lot. But by the time we get to Ezekiel, he's thinking, ooh, these are strange looking things. I'm going to describe them. And when we get to chapter 10, he begins to figure out what they are and kind of match up his thoughts there. So they represent the living creatures. And let's see where I stopped reading. Maybe verse 13, is that where I am? The appearance of the living creatures was like burning coals of fire or like torches. All right, so that it's hard for us to put all these things that Ezekiel is describing together. Would y'all agree? Fire moved back and forth among the creatures. It was bright, and lightning flashed out of it. You know what that sounds like to me? Now, I don't understand any of this stuff. But earlier today, I flipped on one of those switches, and lights came on. It was amazing. What you reckon it sounds like if there is fire moving back and forth, bright, and lightning flashed out of it? Where's Benjamin Franklin when we need him? Doesn't that sound like electricity? Now, it might not be electricity. It might be something entirely different, something incredible and supernatural, but it kind of sounds like electricity, arcing back and forth. The creatures sped back and forth like flashes of lightning. So how fast are these creatures? They fast. Faster than lightning. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its four faces. All right, so they already have strong legs, and they got wings, and now they got wheels. So if you want to get somewhere, legs, wings, wheels might just do the trick, right? And they're faster than lightning anyway, and now they've got these wheels. So Ezekiel sees the wheel, and they sparkled like topaz, and all four looked alike, and each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel. Well, that sounds a little like gears, doesn't it? But maybe not. A wheel within a wheel. And you remember that problem I have backing up? What if your car could go diagonally, or, just what if it had a wheel within a wheel and you could go whatever direction you wanted to whenever you wanted it to? And what if you could control your car with your mind, or in this case, with your spirit? So we're Ezekiel's seeing some things that he doesn't quite, forgive the pun, they're not really in his wheelhouse. It's got wings and wheels and strong legs. So each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel, and as they moved, they would go in any one of the four directions the creatures faced, and the wheels did not change direction as the creatures went. Their rims were high and awesome, and all four rims were full of eyes all around. These wheels, can they see everything? They can. Better than any backup camera you could ask for. Wheels, eyes all around. When the living creatures moved, the wheels beside them moved. And when the living creatures rose from the ground, the wheels also rose. So they're going up, down, sideways, and back, forth. And wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, and the wheels would rise along with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. So there is a connection, supernatural, through the Spirit, between these living creatures and these wheels. When the creatures moved, they also moved. When the creatures stood still, they also stood still. And when the creatures rose from the ground, the wheels rose along with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Whew. So that's an amazing vision. But would y'all believe that's just the beginning of it? That's just the stuff that gets his attention at first. because perhaps these living creatures and the wheels are on eye level. Then Ezekiel looks up. And what does he see when he looks up? Spread out above the heads of the living creatures was what looked something like a vault, a firmament, so to speak, sparkling like crystal and awesome. Under the vault, their wings were stretched out, one toward the other, and each had two wings covering its body. When the creatures moved, I heard the sound of their wings like the roar of rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army. And when they stood still, they lowered their wings. So, is this loud or soft? Loud. Very loud. Then there came a voice from above the vault, above the firmament. So all this, the wheels and the living creatures are down here below. There's this firmament, and then he hears a voice coming from above all of that. And the voice from the vault over their heads as they stood with lowered wings. And above the vault over their heads was what looked like a throne of lapis. Somebody that knows rocks might have to help me out here. Lazuli? I looked that up because, that wasn't something I was terribly familiar with. But it's a very rare, beautiful, purplish thing with gold sprinkled all through it. And high above on the throne was the figure like that of a man. Notice the like that thing again. And I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire, and that from there down he looked like fire, and brilliant light surrounded him. So, sort of looks like a man, but not any man we've ever seen, because he is glowing with brilliant light that surrounds him. Looks like glowing metal as if full of fire. So, turns out these living creatures and these wheels are just the base. There's a firmament between them, and then there is a throne, a beautiful throne with an amazing, incredible, indescribable God sitting on the throne. So, what is this that Ezekiel's seeing? Well, I'm surprised he doesn't use the word chariot, because that will be kind of something that would come to mind, because you got wheels and cart, but it must have been something beyond that, or he'd have used that word. So what you really have here is a mobile throne. The living creatures and the wheels are part of the mobility, and up above is a throne. And separating the living creatures from the throne is a firmament. All right, does that ring any bells? Because we're here on earth, and God is in heaven, and between us and God is a firmament. So it's a powerful, beautiful picture that's being displayed. And Ezekiel doesn't have the words to really describe what he's seeing, but look at this next line, verse 28. Like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of one speaking. Whew. What you reckon he's going to say? Well, that's in chapter 2. So, powerful vision. What's it mean? We spend a lot of time on the vision, but where's it going? What's it mean? Well, would you believe that there are some folks that think they have to come to church to talk to God? Now, I understand that church is a special place, and it's a place of worship, and amazing things happen in church, the building. But are you limited by physically being in the building before you can talk to God? So we've kind of gotten beyond that concept because God doesn't really dwell in buildings made by human beings. So we're up on that. But in the ancient world, that progression of thought hadn't quite gotten there yet. And they had this tendency to think about God being the God of this country. So God's the God of Israel, the God of Judah. The people in Babylon have their own God. People in Egypt have their own God. And when these armies fight, it's really one God against the other, and whichever God's stronger is the one that's going to win the battle. So they kind of spiritualized a lot of human conflict that way. Turns out, though, there is just one God. And does God have any boundaries or borders where God says, I can go this far and no further? No. God can be anywhere. God is everywhere. We just got through with Christmas. And one of the songs that the children sing is about Santa Claus. Y'all might know it. He sees me when I'm sleeping. He knows if I'm awake. He knows if I've been bad or good. So what should I do? Be good for goodness sake. Well, y'all, that's a bit creepy, isn't it? But beyond Santa Claus, God really does see us. And He is everywhere. And these eyes on these wheels and this chariot and throne and living creatures, there is nothing that's going to stop them. God sees absolutely everything. There is nothing in all creation that is hidden from Him. So here's the important part for Ezekiel. They're on the banks of this river in a foreign land, in a refugee shelter camp. They feel like God has abandoned them. Has He? No. God is not bound by the borders of Judah. He is also in what they consider to be a God-forsaken land. Is it a God-forsaken land? Is any land a God-forsaken land? No. God is right there. So this imagery of wheels and wings and legs and a mobile throne helps Ezekiel and the refugees to understand that God has not left them and that God is with them even in this place they consider to be horrible and terrible. And so that is a powerful vision. But that has a two-edged sword about it. Let's go back to Santa Claus for a moment. He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. Why do you think they threw that in there? The children sometimes have a tendency to wake up in the night and not sleep like they're supposed to. He knows if you've been bad or good. If God sees everything, does He see my ugly thoughts? Does He see my poor motivations? Does He see? That's terrifying, isn't it? So the presence of God in Ezekiel and in our lives is both extremely comforting and extremely scary at the same time. Y'all get that? Words of warning and words of assurance. So the refugees need to know that God is still with them. But you remember how this vision started, coming from the north, clouds and lightning. God's coming in judgment as well. And so the words that He will speak to Ezekiel are going to be pretty rough. If we had time tonight, we'd dive into chapter 2, and you'd discover that God has said, these people that I want you to preach to, they are horrible. They are horrible people. At least I'm sending you to a people that speak the same language to you. If I sent you to a people that didn't speak the same language, they would probably believe you and trust. But I'm sending you to your own people, and they're horrible. They're not going to pay attention to what you tell them. But you need to go, because they need the word of the Lord. Whether they accept it or reject it, they're going to need the word of the Lord. And so Ezekiel is given a very, very tough task to preach a message no one wants to hear and that no one is going to abide by. And yet God does not want to leave his people without a witness. And so he sends Ezekiel. And he does it in this very powerful way. David will write, "Where can I go from your spirit? If I go up to the heights, you are there, God. If I go down to the depths, you are there. You know my heart. You know the intention of my life." Sometimes we sing a song, no one understands like Jesus. Yeah. God is with us. He knows us. He misses nothing. He is a powerful presence in our lives. I almost forgot the other stuff I wanted to do. You got a cool picture here that sort of summarizes Ezekiel, and it's tiny, so I kind of blew up the part that we're looking at tonight and next week. So that's on the next page. And then there's this song. Peggy, would you help me? This is a spiritual, Ezekiel Saw the Wheel, written by Southerners during a time of slavery, because they also felt like they were displaced and exiles in a strange, strange land, and they took great comfort in this passage. And so they sang a song as they worked here in the South, and you might recognize it once we get started, but we'll just sing the chorus part because that's the more familiar part. Tools. Ezekiel saw the wheel way up in the middle of the air. Ezekiel saw the wheel way in the middle of the air. The big wheel run by faith, and the little wheel run by the grace of God. A wheel in a wheel way up in the middle of the air. Father, thank you for this powerful vision that you gave to Ezekiel. Thank you that you are with us. Help us to remember in times of temptation that you are with us and will provide the strength we need to resist it. Help us when we feel like nobody understands to remember that you are with us and that you provide what we need. You, Father, show up when we recognize our need for you, just as you did for Ezekiel long ago, you do for us. Help us as we seek to understand more and more of who you are. We ask in Jesus' name.